Imagine giving your whole heart to build a legacy, only to watch your own father hand it to someone who barely lifted a finger. That was my life. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. My name is Ryan Harper. For 10 long years, I poured my entire soul into my family's construction company. When I started, it was nothing but a dusty warehouse, old tools, and a dream. I worked 12-hour days, traveled to job sites before sunrise, met clients at odd hours, and learned every piece of the business from the ground up. I believed I was building my future, and I trusted my father, Marshall Harper, when he promised that one day I would lead the company. While I was working, my younger sister Tessa was off living her own carefree life. She partied through college, went on trips, posted beach pictures, and never once showed interest in the company. Dad always brushed it off, saying she would grow into responsibility. I didn't complain. I thought hard work would speak for itself. So the day Dad called a big board meeting, I thought he was finally ready to pass the company to me. I even wore the suit I bought years ago for when that moment came. My heart was beating fast, full of pride and hope. But hope can cut like glass when it shatters. In front of everyone, my father smiled and announced that the new CEO of Harper Construction would be Tessa, my little sister, the same girl who had never held a real job, who had never set foot on a job site unless she wanted new photos for her social. The room exploded with applause. I didn't clap. I couldn't. My hands felt frozen, and my stomach turned like I'd swallowed a rock. Dad looked right at me and said, "Ryan will continue to support the company in a different capacity." Support. After everything I had done, after sacrificing weekends, relationships, sleep, and youth, I was suddenly just support. Tessa stood there smiling like she earned something. She didn't even look sorry. In fact, when the room cleared, she leaned close and whispered, "Try not to take it personal. Image matters." It felt like someone had reached inside my chest and squeezed my heart hard. I stood there wondering how loyalty could be worth so little. How a daughter who gave everything could be treated like she was nothing. I walked out of that building with my head high, but inside I was broken. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew one thing for sure. I could not stay where I wasn't valued. My story didn't end there. It only began. In my 20s, life didn't look glamorous. I lived in tiny apartments where the walls were thin, the heaters rattled in winter, and the sinks groaned like they were tired of trying. I didn't complain. I was proud, and I believed I was building something real. My meals were usually cheap microwave burritos or noodles cooked on a stove that barely worked. I counted every dollar and stretched every paycheck, because every cent I saved went to courses, equipment, and anything that pushed the company forward. While other people my age were out enjoying late nights, I was walking job sites before the sun came up, wearing hard hats that felt too big in the beginning and boots that blistered my feet. I shook hands with crew leaders, listened to their stories, and learned from every single mistake. I sat through night classes after 10-hour shifts, fighting sleep in business lectures so I could understand contracts, finance, and leadership. It wasn't easy, and there were days I dragged myself home feeling barely alive. But I kept believing effort mattered. Meanwhile, my sister lived like the world was a playground. She breezed through school, took trips whenever she wanted, and moved through life without a worry. While I was carrying folders full of project plans, she was carrying suitcase after suitcase filled with dresses for another sunny getaway. She never talked about responsibility. She never asked how the business worked, but everyone around us always acted like she'd eventually settle down and take interest. I told myself not to think about it too much. I had my lane and I stayed in it. Sometimes, when I sat alone eating dinner after a long day, I imagined the future I was working for. I pictured an office with my name on the door, a team I earned through trust, and a life built on effort instead of shortcuts. I thought loyalty meant something. I thought being dependable and showing up day after day would speak louder than anything. There were moments where fatigue hit so hard my hands shook. I remember falling asleep at a desk surrounded by invoices, construction plans, and half-finished reports, only to wake up and get right back to work. My father saw me grind, saw me sweat, saw me give everything. He nodded in approval, complimented my commitment, and said the company needed someone tough and steady. Hearing that made every sleepless night feel worth it. I didn't envy my sister. Truly, I didn't. She and I lived in separate worlds. She floated through life like the wind carried her, and I pushed through life like I was carving a path with my bare hand. I believed the difference between us would shape the future fairly. I believed the way I lived meant something. Back then, trust was simple to me. Work hard, earn respect, be loyal, build something real. I didn't know that sometimes effort isn't enough, and sometimes the people you trust most can rewrite the rules without warning. I sat there at that long table, surrounded by people who had watched me grow in this world of steel beams, contracts, and early mornings. The room felt strangely quiet to me, even though voices filled the air. I knew something important was coming, but I was unprepared for the shape it took. When my father stood up, adjusting his suit jacket like he was about to make a great announcement, my stomach fluttered with nerves. I expected pride, recognition, maybe a hint of relief that all those demanding years meant something. Instead, he spoke with a calm, measured tone that cut deeper than shouting ever could. He looked around before settling his gaze on me. Not warm, not proud. Plain, like he was giving a weather report. He said I wasn't the right fit to lead. Not because I didn't know the business, not because I lacked skill, but because I was too emotional. The words landed like a punch. That phrase came from the same man who used to say passion was strength. Suddenly, fire was weakness, and dedication was a flaw. Then he turned toward my sister like she was royalty returning to her kingdom. He said she had image and polish, as if appearances mattered more than grit or knowledge or years of commitment. I felt something inside me shift, like a floorboard giving way underfoot. His palm rested gently on her shoulder, and the gesture echoed louder than anything he had just said. That touch said, "She is worthy." And in the same second, without needing any words, it said, "You are not." My chest squeezed tight, breath catching in a way that made the room blur around the edges. I tried to hold myself steady, because if I let even a single tremor show, he would think he was right about me being ruled by feeling. People around the table clapped. Chairs shifted, hands met in approval, faces beamed at Tessa like she had just climbed a mountain instead of walked in on a paved road someone else laid. Each cheerful reaction scraped at me like sandpaper. I kept my eyes forward, refusing to look at her glowing grin. Somewhere inside, a wall that had stood solid for years cracked. I had spent so long believing effort was currency, believing loyalty created security. But in that moment, those beliefs turned to dust. Sand slipping through my fingers, no matter how tightly I tried to hold. My father didn't look apologetic. He didn't look conflicted. He looked certain, as if the decision had been decided long before this moment. I realized then that promises can sound solid until they're broken, and trust can feel safe until someone you love proves it wasn't mutual. My pulse thudded, slow and heavy, as if my heart was trying to understand a world that had suddenly rearranged itself. I sat there silent, spine straight, hands folded so no one would see the shake hiding beneath my skin. Betrayal doesn't always come loudly. Sometimes it's delivered in calm voices, gentle gestures, and applause that feels like a funeral for everything you thought was real. When the meeting finally ended and chairs scraped across the floor, I stayed seated for a moment, trying to swallow the tight knot sitting in my throat. I needed air, space, anything but that room. As people filtered out with cheerful chatter and polite smiles, I stood and gathered my folders slowly, hoping to keep dignity wrapped around me like a coat. That's when I felt her presence at my shoulder. Tessa leaned in, her perfume sugary sweet, too polished for any real labor. Her mouth curved, not in kindness but in triumph. She lowered her voice, though she didn't need to. She wanted me to hear, and she wanted the sting to stick. "Don't worry," she said softly, like a friend offering comfort. "I'll try not to ruin everything." The sentence dripped with false innocence, like she wasn't twisting a knife while pretending to pat my back. It wasn't advice or even teasing. It was a crowning. She was speaking to me the way someone speaks to a new assistant, not the person who sacrificed years carving a path she now skipped along. I looked at her face, smooth and confident, eyes shining not with pride earned, but with opportunity handed. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't even humble. She acted like the position was always meant for her. And in that half second, everything clicked. This wasn't spontaneous. This wasn't a shift caused by sudden doubt in my ability. It was a quiet scheme crafted far earlier, behind doors I wasn't invited through. They didn't just choose her today. They had decided long before my name ever crossed their mind. I hadn't been replaced in that meeting. I had been replaced long ago. I just hadn't been told. I realized then that promises can be spoken with conviction while plans are made in shadows. All those moments when my father praised my dedication, all the times he nodded approvingly as I dragged myself through exhaustion, all the days I believed I was being groomed for leadership, they weren't steps toward a future. They were placeholders. I was a bridge, temporary, useful until someone more convenient arrived. The truth settled in my chest like a heavy stone. I had been preparing for a role that was never actually mine. My palms felt warm, my stomach hollow. Betrayal didn't roar. It landed quietly, like a door closing in the distance, and I couldn't unhear it. I stood straight, looked Tessa in the eyes, and for the first time noticed how smugness sat there, comfortable and unapologetic. She wasn't afraid of failing because she knew if she tripped, someone else would clean up behind her. I had carried weight for years. She floated untouched, cushioned by privilege I never asked for and never received. As she walked away, her heels tapping confidently, I understood something painfully clear. This wasn't about merit, growth, or trust. This was inheritance disguised as leadership. I thought sweat built destiny. They believed birthright did. And in that moment, I knew the door I walked through next wouldn't lead back. It would lead away. I didn't storm out. Rage would have been easy, and tears would have given them a story to tell. Instead, I moved with calm that felt unfamiliar, like wearing someone else's coat. I walked straight to my workspace, closed the door, and sat for a moment in the quiet. My pulse thudded in my ears, but my hands stayed steady as I reached for a blank sheet of paper. No dramatic speech. No pleading. Just a short, clean message stating I was done. When I brought the letter to his office, he looked up with surprise that bordered on annoyance, as though I'd ruined a perfectly neat plan. He skimmed the page and sighed, a tired sound used by people who refuse to see their own part in the mess. "You could remain here," he said lightly, as if offering a gift. "Help guide things for a while. Support your sister as she settles in." Support. That word again. Not partner, not leader, not equal. A helper. A background character in a life I had poured everything into. I met his eyes and answered quietly, "I won't stand behind someone who hasn't earned the right to stand in front." Silence hung thick between us. He gave a stiff nod, already preparing to move on, and I turned away before the weight in my chest cracked open. Back at my desk, I lifted a cardboard container from under the drawer. It had been waiting for years for a different moment, one filled with joy instead of ache. Into it went photos from early project openings, a chipped mug that kept me awake through countless nights, a tiny model crane someone gifted me after our first major contract, little pieces of a journey built through grit. I placed them gently inside, like fragile things you don't want to break more than they already are. I took one last look around, the planning boards covered in diagram, the hard hat leaning on a shelf, the worn binder stuffed with notes I had scribbled over seasons of growth. Every inch of that room held echoes of ambition, but none of that belonged to me anymore. Not really. I carried the box through the hallway. Some workers waved, some looked confused, a few whispered. I didn't stop for explanations. I didn't owe anyone a breakdown of what had happened. A person can't cling to a space that refuses to honor their effort. Outside, the sky felt large and cold, but also honest. No false promises, no pretend applause. At my car, I paused long enough to breathe. Hurt sat inside my ribs, deep and raw. But there was pride there too. I hadn't let them reduce me to a shadow. I hadn't stayed out of fear or habit. My feet stood firm, even as my heart felt scraped and sore. Leaving didn't feel like victory. It felt like survival. And while the path ahead looked uncertain, it also felt clean. I'd rather rebuild from nothing than exist as an afterthought in a place born from my effort. I closed the trunk, wiped my palms on my coat, and drove away without looking back. I spent a few quiet days sitting in my small living room, staring at blank walls like they might tell me what to do next. Silence can be loud when your life suddenly opens into empty space. I didn't rush into decisions. I let the sting settle, let the shock drain out until only a steady pulse of determination remained. I told myself I hadn't lost everything. I had lost a place, not my ability. Then, without warning, a call came through one afternoon. A voice introduced himself as Damon Pike. His tone carried calm authority, not slick charm. He didn't talk like someone fishing for drama or gossip. Instead, he spoke like a man who'd been watching from a distance and already knew the whole picture. Stonebrick and Pike wasn't some startup chasing headline. It was a heavyweight in the same industry, known for tough standards and steady expansion. Their reputation had always been solid, clean, earned. Damon didn't waste time. He said he'd followed my work. He listed projects I had guided, deals I had shaped, and standards I had set. He didn't mention my family, didn't bring up the leadership change, didn't pry into personal wounds. Instead, he asked one question that hit deeper than any condolence. "Are you ready to build something without limits placed on you?" That sentence lit something in me. Not anger, but a steady spark. I realized I wasn't tired from work. I was tired from being underestimated. Damon talked about a role leading a major division, steering strategy, guiding team. Not assisting, not waiting for permission. Leading. It was a door, but more than that, it was an open road. We met the next morning at a sleek office where everything looked orderly but alive. His handshake was firm and sincere. He looked me straight in the eye, like he saw not just who I was, but who I could become. He asked why I left my previous company. I answered simply, "I refuse to stand where I'm not valued." He nodded once. Not sympathetic, but respectful, like that answer was the correct one. Over the table, he laid out expectations and challenges. It wasn't an easy role. It wasn't meant to be. But he didn't talk as if difficulty was punishment. He spoke like challenge was fuel. I felt a hum in my chest, not nervousness, but anticipation. Hunger. Real hunger. The kind built on both loss and potential. When I agreed, my voice didn't shake. It felt like stepping into sunlight after months indoors. Walking out of that building, the air felt different. Crisp, clear, full of promise that didn't need approval from anyone tied to my past. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't about proving something to them. It was about proving something to myself. I still had drive, vision, fire, the quiet kind that burns steady, not wild. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea, not celebrating, just breathing steady. I wasn't going back to rebuild what someone else claimed. I was moving forward to build what was always mine to create. And without saying a word, I knew the chapter ahead would be bigger than anything behind me. The new office wasn't familiar, and the desk didn't hold memories yet, but it felt like fertile ground instead of a cage. I rolled up my sleeves on day one, not expecting applause or soft land. Starting again meant sweat, patience, and a willingness to fight for every inch. I went from department to department, learning the rhythms, shaking hands, listening instead of assuming. Some faces looked curious, some skeptical, a few quietly hopeful. I didn't blame any reactions. Respect isn't given by title, it grows by action. The first major contract that came across my desk was complicated. Tight deadlines, layered regulations, and a client known for being demanding. Perfect. I dove in, reviewing plans late into the night, running numbers twice, sometimes 3 times, calling suppliers and talking directly with foremen instead of sitting safe behind spreadsheets. Strategy met elbow grease, and each decision had weight. We secured that deal. Not because I charmed anyone, but because I showed work that couldn't be ignored. Word traveled. And then something I didn't expect began happening quietly. Familiar faces started showing up. People I had worked beside in another life reached out, saying they heard where I went and asking if there was space for them. Not just managers and engineers, but site leaders and tradespeople. Hard workers. People who valued integrity over titles. They didn't speak about the past. They just wanted to be where standards mattered. Seeing them walk through the doors, trusting me again, hit harder than any award ever could. With people came momentum. Projects rolled in, each one bigger, each one tougher. There were nights when exhaustion sat heavy on my shoulders, when spreadsheets blurred and coffee went cold beside my keyboard. There were mornings when crew meetings began before the sun had fully stretched across the sky. Success didn't flash bright. It simmered through grit, through fixing problems before they turned into disasters, through showing up again and again without needing applause. I led the same way I worked, firm, steady, fair. If someone messed up, we solved it and learned. If someone excelled, I made sure credit landed where it belonged. Teams don't follow authority, they follow authenticity. Slowly, loyalty thickened like poured concrete setting strong beneath us. Crews knew I'd stand beside them in heat, cold, or chaos. Managers saw I expected excellence because I gave it too. And clients felt the difference, not in slogans, but in results. Stonebrick's name began showing up in rooms it hadn't before. Competitors paid attention. The company's progress wasn't loud, but steady enough to draw notice. And through all of it, I never chased revenge. I chased craft. I chased progress. Some nights I sat in my car before driving home, exhausted but strangely steady, knowing I was building something real, not inherited or handed. There was no spotlight, no cheering crowd. Just tired eyes in the mirror, a steady heartbeat, and a quiet pride that came from knowing I was rising again. Not by luck or favoritism, but by earning every single step. The first whispers came softly, almost like wind slipping under a door. A former vendor called one evening, asking if I knew anyone at my old workplace who could help untangle a payment issue. I didn't answer with gossip or bitterness. I just gave him the right contact and wished him luck. But his pause before hanging up told me more than his words. Something unstable was moving beneath those familiar floors. Then a foreman I used to supervise bumped into me at a supply yard. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight like he was choosing each phrase carefully. He mentioned delays, paperwork chaos, confusion at the top. Not in a gloating way, not fishing for drama. More like someone watching a structure he once trusted start to sag. When he realized what he'd said, he apologized quickly, as if he'd crossed a line. I didn't ask questions. I simply nodded and walked away with a weight settling low in my chest. As the months passed, a pattern formed. Messages trickled in from people I once knew well. Subcontractors losing patience, crews frustrated, accounts unsettled, timelines slipping. The words all carried the same tone, disappointment mixed with disbelief. It stung in a way that felt complicated. I had no satisfaction in their struggle. There was only a dull ache where loyalty used to live. They weren't just talking about missteps. They were talking about a structure shaking at its foundation. And that foundation had once been mine to guard. Meanwhile, at family gatherings, the air would tighten the moment I stepped through the door. My father tried to speak casually, but his voice held a sharpness, like someone trying to protect pride with stubbornness. He talked in short sentences, polished and overly confident, as if he could will stability into existence by refusing to acknowledge cracks. He asked nothing about my new work, offered no warmth, avoided eye contact when certain names came up. He clung to the idea that his choice was right, even as doubt flickered in his eyes like an unsteady light bulb. Tessa showed up with glossy smiles and loud stories that didn't match the strain beneath them. Her laugh came too fast, her posture too rigid. She avoided specifics, never mentioning dates or outcomes, only vague optimism. When relatives asked about the company, she waved a hand like everything was perfectly under control. But her fingers twitched against her glass, and her eyes darted toward our father for reassurance. He always nodded quickly, as if fear might break loose if he hesitated. The holiday table felt colder than the winter outside. Conversations stayed on safe topics, like weather and sports, never daring to touch the silent storm hanging above us. I kept my tone even, offered polite greetings, and held my composure. I didn't bring up business. I didn't smirk or hint at what I'd heard. Pride rooted me in restraint. Justice didn't need me to narrate it. Driving home after one gathering, snow tapped lightly against my windshield. The world outside looked peaceful, and in that quiet, a truth settled in me. Sometimes consequences arrive without applause or confrontation. Sometimes they simply unfold, one quiet fracture at a time. And while it hurt to watch a family unravel around decisions I didn't make, I also knew one thing with certainty. The sting from being overlooked might fade, but memory doesn't forget who showed their true colors when the stakes were high. The news didn't arrive like a dramatic headline. It slipped into my day through a simple message from a former project manager. "Did you hear?" Then the details followed like slow, heavy drops of water leaking through a ceiling. A major public sector bid had slipped through their fingers, not from bad luck or unfair competition, but because someone at the top chose shortcuts where they were least forgiven. The awarding agency flagged compliance issues, quality concerns, and rushed timelines. In the construction world, that kind of mistake isn't a bruise. It's a fracture that spreads. I sat at my desk as the pieces assembled themselves. Reports of halted work, phones ringing for refunds, vendors pushing for unpaid balances. A company once steady now wobbling under weight it couldn't hold. It wasn't just about losing a contract. It was about credibility collapsing, trust evaporating. When leadership gambles reputation for flash, the bill always comes due. More updates trickled through. Lenders started asking questions. Accounts tightened. People I respected years ago scrambled to keep things afloat, their voices carrying worry they never imagined facing under that. My chest tightened, not from joy or vindication, but from a quiet sadness. I remembered long mornings walking job sites, believing those walls would stand strong long after I stepped away. Now they creaked under pressure created by inexperience dressed as confident. Then one afternoon my phone rang. His name on the screen froze me for a moment. I answered anyway. My father's voice didn't sound like the commanding tone that once filled conference room. It sounded strained, smaller, as if pride had been scraped thin. He spoke without the polished certainty he used to wear like armor. No grand speeches, no forceful authority. Just a trembling attempt at control. He mentioned challenges, choosing delicate words like someone trying to wrap disaster in soft fabric. He didn't mention mistakes, didn't name decisions. Instead, he slid around the truth until finally, after clearing his throat twice, he asked if I could come back and help family. Help. Not support someone else. Not stand behind. Help. The difference landed hard. It wasn't an invitation wrapped in generosity. It was a lifeline thrown from sinking ground. That tone he once reserved for discipline now carried strain, like he was piecing together hope from scraps. I let silence sit between us. In that quiet space, years of trust, effort, dismissal, and heartbreak layered themselves in front of me like stacked bricks. I heard fatigue in his breathing, a slight shake in his words. Gone was the certainty that image would carry them. Gone was the casual dismissal of my work. It wasn't arrogance speaking now. It was fear. I responded gently, not harsh, not vengeful. I simply said I had found my place and was committed to the work I was doing. He exhaled softly, a sound that felt like surrender more than understanding. When we hung up, my hands rested in my lap for a long moment. I didn't feel triumph, just a bittersweet ache. Sometimes life doesn't punish loudly. Sometimes it simply shows what happens when ego replaces merit and assumption tries to outrun preparation. The structure I once tended had cracked under the weight of choices never meant to hold. And for the first time, he saw it too. His request lingered for days, floating in the back of my mind like fog refusing to lift. Not because I wavered, but because it marked a moment I once dreamed of in a very different way. Years ago, if he had asked for my guidance, I would have rushed in with open hands and a ready plan. Back then, I believed shared blood meant shared loyalty. Time, however, teaches its own lessons. I had already learned mine. When we spoke again, his tone carried a hollow softness, as if hope had drained but routine demanded he try once more. I listened, letting him finish every sentence without interrupting. There was no need for harshness. Pain had already done its teaching. When he paused, waiting for some door to swing open, I answered in a voice steady as stone. I told him respect cannot be requested only when convenient. I told him trust isn't a coat you put on when the weather turns harsh. I told him family should never expect faithfulness it never offered. My words weren't raised or sharp. They simply rested in truth, calm and final. He didn't argue. He didn't defend decisions or rewrite the past. Just a quiet sigh, soft and tired, like someone who finally saw the cost of choices made long before consequences arrive. When the call ended, there was no victory in me, only relief, like setting down a weight I had carried too long. Life moved forward with a rhythm that felt balanced. My days at Stonebrook filled with steady progress, smart strategy, and people who believed effort mattered more than last names or polished appearances. Leaders respected outcomes. Teams supported one another. Growth didn't roar, it unfolded, steady and earned. I woke each morning not with dread or pressure to prove something to ghosts of expectations, but with clear purpose. Pride became fuel, not bitterness. The past stopped clutching at me. Revenge faded because peace had taken its place. In the industry, new voices rose. My sister's name stopped appearing in conversations. Whispers of her struggle drifted through occasionally, then dissolved. She slipped into the background, not through scandal or drama, but through quiet erosion. Without discipline or understanding behind her title, influence simply evaporated. Not because I pushed her aside, but because the role she was handed needed hands willing to build, not simply hold. And my father? He stayed mostly silent after that call. I heard through passing conversations that he kept trying to hold pieces together. But some structures can't be restored once the foundation has been neglected. Legacy, I realized, isn't a crown passed down. It's something shaped every day by honesty, work, and responsibility. He learned that truth the hard way, and the lesson didn't need my applause. One morning months later, I drove past the building that once held every hope I clung to in my younger years. The front sign looked worn, colors dulled, edges chipped. I slowed for just a moment, not to gloat, not to mourn, but to breathe in what freedom felt like. A small smile rose, gentle and genuine, not triumphant, just peaceful. Then I drove on, toward a future built by my own hands, not granted, not taken, simply earned. Hey besties, thanks for staying with me through that journey. Walking away from what I built wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a life shaped by my own choices, not someone else's control. Sometimes peace is the quiet victory no one sees coming. If this hit you, show some love. Like, share, drop a comment, and hit subscribe for more stories. See you next time. Bye.